The concrete floor of the mess hall rang out with sounds that had become routine in the POW camp that autumn morning. The scraping of worn military boots, the metallic clang of food trays being stacked and distributed, the low murmur of voices speaking in a language that wasn't English. Outside the windows, the Texas landscape stretched flat and endless under a pale sky, so different from the European terrain these men had known. And inside the building, rows of tables waited as American soldiers in uniform stood watch along the walls, their expressions neutral and professional as they observed the daily ritual of feeding the enemy. The year was drawing toward its end. 1943 had brought decisive turns in the war, and among the consequences of those shifts were the hundreds of captured German soldiers now housed in camps across the American heartland, far from the deserts of North Africa where many had fought, far from the Italian countryside where others had been taken prisoner, far from everything they had ever known about warfare and about the world itself. These were not fresh recruits or boys playing at being soldiers. Among them stood veterans who had survived the brutal campaigns under Rommel, men whose skin had been darkened and aged by the relentless sun of the Sahara, whose eyes held the hardness that comes from watching comrades fall in combat, whose bodies bore the scars of a war that had already consumed years of their lives. Others were younger, some barely out of their teenage years, captured during the fighting in Sicily or on the Italian mainland, their faces still soft despite the dirt that clung to them and the exhaustion that weighed down their movements. What united them all, regardless of age or experience, was the rigid discipline they maintained even in defeat, the way they held themselves upright despite ragged uniforms, the way they moved in formation even when formation no longer mattered, the way they clung to the remnants of military order as though it were the last thread connecting them to who they had been before capture. The morning routine proceeded as it always did. Guards directing prisoners to their designated seating areas, men shuffling forward to receive whatever breakfast had been prepared. The usual atmosphere of sullen compliance mixed with barely concealed resentment. What happened next, however, would etch itself into memory far more deeply than any ordinary morning meal. The kitchen workers began bringing out the food, and as the first plates reached the tables, a ripple of reaction spread through the assembled prisoners. Stacked high on each plate were soft, pale golden circles, steam rising from their surfaces in the cool air, their texture light and fluffy in a way that seemed almost unreal to men accustomed to denser fare. Across the top of these mysterious discs, someone had drizzled a thick amber liquid that caught the light and glistened with an almost obscene richness. The laughter started almost immediately, first as scattered chuckles, then building into waves of genuine mirth that echoed off the bare walls of the mess hall. Prisoners looked at each other with expressions of disbelief and derision, elbowing their neighbours and gesturing at the plates before them as though someone had just told an elaborate joke. One man, his voice carrying clearly despite his imperfect grasp of English, called out loudly enough for the guards to hear that this looked like something meant for infants, not for grown men, and certainly not for soldiers. Another leaned toward his companion and muttered in German, his tone dripping with contempt, that perhaps the Americans believed wars could be won by feeding their troops dessert instead of proper sustenance. The mockery spread like wildfire, men slapping the tables and pointing at the offending pancakes, some making exaggerated gestures of confusion as though they couldn't comprehend what they were seeing, others shaking their heads with theatrical dismay. For these prisoners, the contrast could not have been more stark or more absurd. They had been raised on bread that was nothing like these pale, pillowy circles, bread that came in dense black loaves heavy enough to serve as weapons if necessary. Bread made from dark rye flour that required real effort to chew and digest. Bread that sat in the stomach like ballast and provided the kind of lasting fuel a man needed to march through snow or desert heat. Schwarzbrot, they called it, black bread, and it represented everything they believed about proper nutrition and military strength. A soldier needed food with substance, with weight, with the kind of heft that declared itself seriously even before the first bite. These pancakes, by comparison, looked like nothing at all, like air that had been briefly condensed into edible form, like the kind of frivolous treat one might give to a child on a special occasion, but never to a fighting man. The ridicule intensified as more prisoners received their portions, men banging their fists on the tabletops in mock celebration, one fellow rising to his feet to deliver a sarcastic speech about the mighty American military machine and its fearsome breakfast cakes, others joining in with catcalls and jeers. Their voices carried the particular edge that comes from men who have lost everything except their pride and are determined to hold on to that last possession with desperate intensity. Here they sat, defeated and imprisoned, thousands of miles from home, their uniforms reduced to rags, their boots falling apart, their bodies thin from the privations of war, and yet in this moment they could still feel superior because they absolutely knew, that their culture understood food and strength and military discipline in ways these soft Americans never could. The guards stationed around the perimeter of the hall watched all of this unfold with expressions that revealed nothing, their faces as blank as the walls behind them. They exchanged brief glances with each other, slight movements of eyes that communicated understanding without words, but they made no move to silence the laughter or to respond to the taunts. Perhaps they had been briefed on what to expect, perhaps they had seen similar reactions from other groups of prisoners, or perhaps they simply understood that sometimes the best response is no response at all, that certain lessons teach themselves without need for intervention. They stood and waited, these young American soldiers tasked with the unglamorous duty of guarding captured enemies, and they let the mockery run its course. The energy in the room crackled with a strange kind of electricity, the prisoners feeding off each other's disdain, their voices rising and falling in waves of derision, their laughter taking on an almost hysterical quality, as though they had discovered something hilariously absurd that confirmed all their existing beliefs about American weakness and frivolity. Some men doubled over with exaggerated mirth, others wiped at their eyes as though the very sight of the pancakes had moved them to tears of amusement. Still others shook their heads with the kind of pitying condescension usually reserved for children who have done something foolish but harmless. One prisoner pushed his plate away with a theatrical gesture of disgust, as though even proximity to such ridiculous food might contaminate him, while his table-mate picked up a fork and held it like a specimen for examination, turning it this way and that as if trying to understand how anyone could take such a meal seriously. What they didn't realize, couldn't possibly have understood in that moment of smug superiority, was that their laughter carried within it the seeds of its own undoing. They had grown up in a world where bread defined civilization, where the quality and type of bread a nation produced served as a measure of its strength and character, where the very act of breaking bread together held ritualistic significance that went back centuries. German bread, particularly the dark rye varieties, represented not just nutrition, but identity, a connection to the soil and to tradition, a tangible expression of values like endurance and resilience and the willingness to choose substance over superficial pleasure. In their minds, and they weren't entirely wrong about this, the kind of bread a society produced revealed fundamental truths about that society's priorities and character. Their own experiences had reinforced these beliefs over years of military service. During the campaigns in North Africa, soldiers of the Afrika Korps had carried chunks of black bread in their packs, gnawing on it between firefights, finding in its dense texture and bitter flavour a kind of comfort and connection to home even in the alien landscape of the desert. The bread sustained them through sandstorms and heat that could kill a man in hours, through long marches and longer battles, through periods of scarcity when other rations ran low. It became more than food, it became a symbol of Germanic toughness, proof that they could endure hardships that would break lesser men. The very difficulty of the bread, the way it required strong jaws and good teeth to consume, seemed to reinforce their sense of being a warrior people, hard in ways that softer nations could never understand. Sitting there in that Texas mess hall, surrounded by the smell of butter and maple syrup, they drew on these memories to fuel their contempt. One man, an officer whose uniform still bore the faded insignia of his rank despite months of wear, leaned back in his chair with the confidence of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. His name was Karl-Heinz Richter. He held the rank of Oberleutnant, and though his clothing showed the stains and damage of desert combat, though sand from Africa still clung to the fabric in places, his voice carried the authority of education and class when he spoke. He brought his palm down on the table with enough force to make the plates jump, and declared, loud enough for half the room to hear, that real soldiers ate to sustain themselves for combat, not to indulge in childish pleasures. Around him, heads nodded in agreement, men murmuring their approval of this sentiment, reinforcing each other's certainty that they understood something fundamental about warfare that these Americans, with their sweet breakfast cakes, apparently did not grasp. The conversation at the tables turned to comparisons, prisoners describing to each other the proper meals they had known before the war, the traditional German breakfast of Brotzeit with its hearty bread, its thick slices of sausage, its sharp pickles and strong cheese. They spoke nostalgically of mornings in Bavaria or Prussia or Saxony, of mothers and wives who knew how to lay out a breakfast that would carry a man through a day of hard labour, of the satisfying weight of real food in the belly. One corporal boasted that German soldiers could march for days on nothing but black bread and schnapps, covering distances that would leave other armies exhausted and broken, and his companions agreed enthusiastically, each adding their own variations on the theme of Germanic endurance versus the apparent softness of American military culture. This pride, this defensive assertion of cultural superiority, filled the mess hall like a physical presence, an invisible barrier these men erected between themselves and their captors. It served a psychological purpose, allowing them to maintain some sense of dignity in circumstances that might otherwise have crushed their spirits entirely. They had been defeated on the battlefield, captured and shipped across an ocean, imprisoned in a foreign land where everything from the landscape to the language felt alien and wrong, stripped of their weapons and their freedom and their ability to determine their own fates. Pride in their cultural identity, in the supposed toughness and superiority of German ways of living and eating and being, represented perhaps the last thing that couldn't be taken from them, the final redoubt where they could still feel like victors rather than victims. But that pride, fierce as it burned in that moment, rested on foundations more fragile than they knew. The Germany they remembered and celebrated, the Germany of abundance and strength and cultural certainty, had already begun to crumble under the weight of total war. While these prisoners sat in American camps mocking pancakes, their families back home stood in ration lines that stretched around city blocks, waiting hours for meagre allotments of food that grew smaller and more adulterated with each passing month. The black bread they remembered with such nostalgia had become increasingly difficult to obtain. Bakers forced to stretch their rye flour with potato flour, with sawdust, with whatever filler materials they could find to create something that still resembled bread even as its nutritional value declined. In Hamburg and Berlin and Dresden and countless other cities, children searched through rubble and garbage for anything edible. Mothers traded family heirlooms for a few extra grams of butter or meat. Elderly people grew thin and hollow-eyed from malnutrition. The prisoners didn't know this yet, or if some had heard rumours, they chose not to believe them, preferring to hold on to their memories of a Germany that had perhaps never existed in quite the idealised form they imagined. So they continued to laugh and mock, secure in their conviction that the pancakes before them represented everything weak and foolish about American culture, never suspecting that these same ridiculous cakes would soon become the instrument of a profound reversal, a moment of recognition that would stay with many of them for the rest of their lives. Among the American guards watching this display, there existed a kind of knowing patience, the awareness that sometimes truth reveals itself more powerfully when discovered than when explained. They had witnessed similar scenes before, the initial mockery and derision, the proud declarations of cultural superiority, the certainty that would soon give way to something else entirely. One guard, a farm boy from the Midwest who had grown up eating his mother's pancakes every Sunday morning, allowed himself the smallest hint of a smile as he watched the German prisoners perform their theatrical disgust. He knew what was coming, had seen it happen before, and he found a certain satisfaction in waiting for the moment of revelation. The mess hall gradually quieted as the prisoners exhausted their initial burst of mockery, settling into a kind of sullen waiting, uncertain what was expected of them, but unwilling to be the first to actually eat the food they had spent so much energy ridiculing. The pancakes sat on their plates, cooling slightly but still emanating warmth, the syrup pooling in golden pockets on their surfaces, the butter slowly melting into translucent patches. The smell permeated the room, sweet and rich and utterly foreign to men accustomed to the sharp, yeasty aroma of rye bread and the bitter scent of ersatz coffee made from roasted grain or acorns. Finally, inevitably, someone had to take the first bite, and that distinction fell to a young corporal named Dieter Hoffmann, barely 21 years old, his face still holding some of the roundness of youth, despite the leanness that months of combat and captivity had carved into his frame. His friends at the table urged him on, daring him to taste the children's food, laughing in anticipation of whatever disgusted face he would make. Hoffmann played along, rolling his eyes and sighing dramatically as though being asked to perform some onerous and ridiculous task. He speared a piece of pancake with his fork, making sure everyone around him was watching, lifted it slowly toward his mouth while his companions grinned and waited for the punchline. The moment the food touched his tongue, something shifted in his expression, a flicker of surprise that he couldn't quite control, a momentary confusion as his expectations collided with reality. He chewed, and the texture proved nothing like what he had anticipated, soft and fluffy and almost impossibly light, dissolving against his palate in a way that felt more like a dream than a meal. The sweetness of the syrup registered next, not cloying or overwhelming, but warm and comforting, blending with the butter to create flavors that his wartime-deprived senses hadn't experienced in longer than he could remember. He swallowed, and instead of making a joke or spitting it out or confirming everyone's expectations, he simply sat there for a heartbeat, his fork still raised, his face betraying genuine astonishment. Then, without a word, without any of the theatrical commentary his friends had expected, Hoffmann lowered his fork to the plate and cut another piece, larger this time, and shoved it into his mouth with an urgency that had nothing to do with mockery and everything to do with sudden, unexpected hunger. His table-mates watched this transformation with growing curiosity, their smiles fading as they tried to understand what they were witnessing. A sergeant leaned forward, eyebrows drawing together, waiting for Hoffmann to say something, to explain the joke they weren't getting. But Hoffmann had stopped performing, his entire attention focused on the plate in front of him, on consuming what remained there with a speed and intensity that spoke of genuine desire rather than theatrical scorn. Around the mess hall, other prisoners began to notice this change, this absence of laughter from one table, this strange silence that seemed to radiate outward from wherever someone had actually tasted the food. Curiosity overcame pride, and more men lifted their forks, some still smirking and expecting to confirm their disdain, others watching Hoffmann and wondering what had caused such a reaction. The first bites spread through the room like a wave, and everywhere that wave touched, the mockery died, replaced by a different kind of silence, the silence of men discovering something that contradicted everything they thought they knew. The pancakes were not what they had expected, not in texture or flavour or effect. For men who had spent months, sometimes years, eating the monotonous and increasingly inadequate rations of an army losing its supply lines, whose taste buds had grown accustomed to bitterness and blandness and the peculiar chemical flavour of preserved foods past their prime, this sudden explosion of sweetness and richness represented a sensory shock. The butter had been real butter, not the pale margarine or lard substitutes they had grown used to, and its creamy smoothness coated their mouths in a way that felt almost decadent. The syrup, genuine maple syrup, brought from the forests of Vermont and New England, carried within it notes of flavour so complex and layered that men who had forgotten such things existed found themselves closing their eyes involuntarily as they chewed, shutting out the world to focus entirely on taste. The transformation rippled outward, table by table, man by man, the sounds of eating replacing the sounds of derision. Forks scraped against plates with increasing urgency. Knives cut through the soft cake with unnecessary force, as though the wielders couldn't quite believe how easy it was, how little resistance the food offered. Some prisoners, their faces gaunt from the privations of war and imprisonment, ate with a kind of desperate focus, as though afraid that if they looked away even for a moment, the food might vanish like a mirage. Others showed more restraint, but their hands betrayed them, trembling slightly as they brought each bite to their mouths, their jaws working steadily and methodically to extract every possible sensation from the experience. One man, who had earlier laughed so hard at the sight of the pancakes that tears had streamed down his weathered cheeks, now found himself nearly motionless, a forkful of food halfway to his mouth, his eyes open but unseeing as he processed what was happening. When he finally completed the motion and took the bite, his eyes closed and remained that way for several seconds, his expression unreadable, somewhere between pain and pleasure, between memory and present reality. At another table, a prisoner who had survived the hell of El Alamein, who had watched friends die in the desert heat and had himself nearly died of thirst and wounds, now sat with both hands braced on the table edge, staring down at his empty plate as though trying to understand how it had become empty without his conscious awareness of eating. Later, when the camps were liberated and records examined, historians would find a diary entry from this very morning, written in cramped German script on a scrap of paper, the handwriting shaky and uncertain. The anonymous author, one of the hundreds of prisoners present that day, had written simply and honestly about the experience, confessing that he had not expected anything like what he encountered, describing the pancakes as sweet and warm and unlike anything he had tasted in Germany, admitting that he had laughed at first, but then eaten and then wanted more. The brevity of the entry, just a few sentences scrawled in the margins of what appeared to be a letter never sent, somehow captured the essence of what many felt but could not articulate. The collapse of certainty, the sudden vulnerability that comes when the world proves different from everything you've been taught to expect. The silence that filled the mess hall after those first bites was not peaceful, but charged with a kind of tension, the tension of cognitive dissonance, of men trying to reconcile their beliefs with their experiences and finding the task more difficult than they had imagined. They had been so certain, so absolutely convinced that these pancakes represented American weakness and foolishness, that German culture and German food and German discipline were superior in every meaningful way. The evidence of their taste buds contradicted that certainty, undermined it in ways that no propaganda speech or military defeat could have achieved. This was visceral truth, undeniable and immediate, and it left them unsettled in ways they couldn't fully acknowledge. The kitchen staff, American soldiers assigned to the unglamorous work of preparing meals for prisoners, noticed the change in atmosphere even from their positions behind the serving line. They had prepared this breakfast like any other, following the standard recipes and quantities, expecting nothing more than the usual sullen acceptance or occasional complaint. What they witnessed instead was something closer to revelation. Grown men eating with an intensity that bordered on desperation, plates being cleaned so thoroughly that not a trace of syrup remained, men staring at empty dishes as though trying to will more food into existence through concentration alone. Then came the moment when the first prisoner stood up, his plate scraped clean, his eyes scanning the room until they found the serving line. He raised his tin plate above his head and called out, his English broken and heavily accented, but his meaning unmistakable, demanding more, asking for seconds, his voice cracking somewhere between command and plea. A guard looked up, eyebrow raised in mild surprise, but made no objection, signalling toward the kitchen with a casual gesture. The prisoner moved forward, and as though a dam had broken, others rose to follow him, a line forming with surprising speed. Men who moments before had been mocking these pancakes, now pushing and jostling for position, each wanting to ensure he would not be left out when the next round was distributed. The chaos built gradually at first, then with increasing momentum as more men finished their initial portions and realized that more might be available. Arguments erupted at some tables, angry whispers in German about who had taken more than their share, about whether someone had stolen an extra piece when no one was looking, about the propriety of grown men fighting over breakfast food like children quarrelling over candy. One prisoner accused his neighbour of theft, the two men rising to their feet, fists clenched, voices rising to shouts before a sergeant barked at them to sit down and maintain some semblance of dignity. Even as he gave this order, even as he reminded them that they were soldiers and prisoners of war who should conduct themselves with appropriate discipline, his own eyes drifted to his plate, noting with something like shame how quickly he had consumed everything there. At another table, two men literally grabbed for the same piece of pancake, left behind on a shared serving platter, their hands colliding, their grips tightening, a brief tug-of-war ensuing until an American guard stepped in, physically separating them with an expression that mixed amusement and disbelief. The guard shook his head slowly, saying nothing but communicating volumes through that single gesture, and the two prisoners stepped back, embarrassed but still hungry, still wanting what they had been fighting over. The desperation was palpable now, no longer hidden behind pride or ideological certainty, but exposed and raw. These were men who had endured genuine hardship, who had survived combat and capture, who had learned to control their emotions and their desires through military discipline and force of will. Yet here they were, reduced to begging and fighting over breakfast, over food they had ridiculed just minutes before. The reversal was complete and devastating, stripping away the last vestiges of the superiority they had tried to maintain. A letter fragment, found years later in the archives of the camp, preserved this moment with painful honesty. The writer, whose name was lost when the pages separated, described how they had laughed at the Americans and then fought over their food, how he had seen comrades he trusted in battle push each other aside for another taste, how the entire experience felt shameful and yet utterly real, driven by a hunger that was about more than just empty stomachs, a hunger that touched something deeper and more fundamental about their situation and their lives. The American kitchen workers, most of them young men from farms and small towns across the country, exchanged knowing glances as they watched this unfold. One cook, a lanky youth from Iowa whose own family had struggled through the Depression eating pancakes because flour was cheap and eggs could be gathered from their own chickens, muttered to his companion that apparently the Germans liked the food after all, his tone dry and understated, capturing the profound irony of the moment without need for elaboration. The irony was indeed rich beyond measure. Men who had marched under banners proclaiming Aryan supremacy, soldiers who had been taught from childhood that German culture represented the pinnacle of civilization, now reduced to scrambling and fighting for seconds of a breakfast they had considered suitable only for children. The mess hall swelled with noise again, but this time the sounds carried a different quality, not mockery but urgency, not derision but desire. Chairs scraped across concrete floors as men rose and moved toward the serving line. Boots stomped and shuffled as positions were jockeyed for, trays clattered and clanged as they were thrust forward for refilling. Voices rose in demands and questions and arguments, all of it creating a cacophony that spoke of control slipping away, of hunger overwhelming ideology, of basic human need asserting itself over political beliefs and cultural prejudices. What had begun as a meal served in routine fashion, what had started with laughter and scorn, had transformed into something closer to chaos, a hall full of men confronting the gap between what they had believed and what they were experiencing. The most ordinary of foods, pancakes made from the most basic ingredients, had accomplished what no military defeat could achieve. It had forced these prisoners to question their certainties, to recognize that perhaps the world was more complicated than the simple narratives they had been fed, to understand through the most visceral means possible that strength and weakness, superiority and inferiority were not distributed along the lines they had been taught to believe. For the first time since their capture, the balance of power in that room shifted in a way that had nothing to do with weapons or guards or barbed wire fences. The real power lay with whoever controlled access to the next batch of pancakes, and that power belonged entirely to the Americans, who wielded it not with cruelty, but with a kind of casual abundance that was perhaps even more devastating to witness. Behind every golden pancake that emerged from that kitchen, behind every plate served and every second helping granted, lay a truth that extended far beyond the walls of this particular mess hall, a truth about the vast productive capacity of American agriculture and industry, about a nation that could fight a global war on multiple continents while still maintaining domestic abundance, about resources so plentiful that even captured enemies could be fed with food that seemed almost wasteful in its richness. The prisoners understood scarcity in ways that most Americans, even those who had lived through the Depression, could not fully grasp. They knew what it meant to stand in line for hours hoping for a small ration of bread, to watch children grow thin and listless from inadequate nutrition, to see elderly parents slowly weaken and fade because there simply wasn't enough food to go around. They carried memories of ersatz coffee that tasted like burnt dirt, of sausages stretched with filler until they barely qualified as meat, of bread that grew darker and denser as bakers added whatever they could find to extend their dwindling supplies of grain. They had lived through winters where heating fuel ran short and food ran shorter, where every meal became a calculation of how to make meagre supplies last one more day, one more week, one more month. By 1943, Germany's home front was experiencing deprivations that would only grow worse as the war ground on. Women in Hamburg and Essen and Cologne stood in ration queues that wrapped around entire city blocks, waiting for hours in all weather for their allotted portions, which shrank with each passing month. Children who should have been growing strong and healthy instead showed the signs of chronic malnutrition, their growth stunted, their resistance to disease weakened, their energy levels dropping. The black bread that prisoners remembered so fondly had become increasingly adulterated, bakers forced to mix in potato flour or even sawdust to create loaves that still looked like bread but provided little real nutrition. Coffee, real coffee, had become a luxury beyond the reach of most families, replaced by bitter brews made from roasted grain or ground acorns that bore only the faintest resemblance to the genuine article. And yet here sat these men in a prison camp thousands of miles from home, being served breakfast that would have seemed like a feast even in peacetime Germany, food made with real butter and real eggs and genuine maple syrup, ingredients that had become mythically rare back in the fatherland. The cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable. How could the enemy, the nation they had been sent to help destroy, possess such abundance that it could afford to waste these precious resources on prisoners? How could a country supposedly weakened by its own indulgence and lack of discipline command such plenty that its captured foes ate better than its own soldiers? One prisoner, sitting alone at the end of a table, whispered something to himself, the words barely audible but captured by the sharp ears of a nearby guard who understood some German. He had said, in a voice trembling with emotion he tried to suppress, that back home his daughter stood in line all day for bread, that his wife traded precious possessions for handfuls of butter or flour, that his family probably hadn't tasted anything as rich as these pancakes in years. He fell silent immediately after this confession, embarrassed to have spoken aloud, afraid that his companions might have heard and judged him for this moment of weakness. But around him, other men sat with similar thoughts unspoken, each carrying private knowledge of loved ones' suffering while they themselves ate food that seemed almost obscenely abundant. The guards understood the symbolism of this moment, whether consciously or intuitively, understanding that every bite these prisoners took carried a message far more powerful than any propaganda leaflet or radio broadcast could deliver. The message was simple but devastating. America could afford to be generous because it had no fear of running out, no concern that feeding its enemies might somehow weaken its own citizens, no anxiety about scarcity that might force difficult choices between competing needs. The Pancakes announced, in the most direct way possible, that this was a nation of such productive capacity, of such vast agricultural and industrial might, that it could wage war across oceans and continents while still maintaining standards of living that surpassed what Germany could offer even in peacetime. Among the guards, there stood men whose presence carried its own powerful message, American soldiers who would have been invisible or despised in the racial hierarchy that governed the Reich. One of the kitchen workers, a man named Samuel Brooks from Louisiana, whose skin was dark and whose ancestors had been brought to America in chains, now carried trays of pancakes with dignity and authority, serving food to men who had been taught to consider him subhuman. A German officer watched this happen, watched Brooks move efficiently through his duties, giving orders to other kitchen staff, controlling the flow of food with casual competence, and found himself unable to process what this meant, unable to reconcile the propaganda he had absorbed about racial hierarchies with the reality of a man he should have been able to dismiss exercising real power over captured German soldiers. The moment stretched and expanded, becoming more than just a breakfast, becoming a lesson in ways that no one had explicitly planned, but that emerged organically from the simple facts of the situation. Here was a man, a black man, feeding his captors, making decisions about who got seconds and how much syrup to provide, wielding the kind of mundane authority that came from doing a job competently, and there was nothing the prisoners could do except accept what he offered and be grateful for it. The irony cut deep, deeper than most could articulate, but they felt it nonetheless, felt the collapse of certainties they had once held as absolute truths. No words were exchanged in this moment, no speeches made or lessons explicitly taught, but the silence itself communicated volumes. Brooks set down another tray of pancakes, his movements economical and practiced, and the German lieutenant who had been watching him could not meet his eyes, could not acknowledge what he was witnessing because acknowledgement would require confronting too many contradictions, would demand too much rethinking of beliefs that had been fundamental to his understanding of the world. Throughout the barracks, rumours spread with the speed that only gossip can achieve in close quarters among bored and isolated men. Whispers passed from table to table about how the guards had seemed amused rather than annoyed by the chaos, about how they had allowed seconds and even thirds, about how some Americans had even smiled, actually smiled, at the sight of German prisoners licking their plates clean and demanding more. The stories grew in the telling, as stories do, but beneath the exaggerations lay a core of truth that unsettled many who heard it. Their captors had treated them not with cruelty, but with something closer to kindness, had fed them better than their own country could manage, had responded to their hunger not with mockery or denial, but with additional portions of food that their own families were probably eating that very morning. One diary entry, recovered long after the war, captured this confusion perfectly. The writer described how strange it felt that enemies could laugh together, could share a moment of human connection over something as simple as breakfast. He noted that the guards had given them syrup twice, that there had been smiles exchanged, brief and awkward but genuine, and that for those few minutes the war had seemed very distant, almost unreal, as though it were happening to different people in a different world. The entry trailed off, the writer apparently unable or unwilling to explore the implications further, but the words preserved a moment of uncertainty, of worldviews cracking under the pressure of experiences that didn't fit the expected patterns. The arguments among the prisoners themselves intensified as the morning wore on, not arguments with their captors but among each other, debates that carried undertones of something close to crisis. Some men insisted loudly that this was all manipulation, a calculated American strategy to weaken their spirits and undermine their morale, that accepting this food and enjoying it represented a kind of betrayal of everything they had fought for. Others, still tasting sweetness on their tongues, asked questions that would have been unthinkable just hours before, wondering aloud whether perhaps they had been lied to about more than just the quality of American food, whether the entire edifice of what they had been taught might rest on similarly shaky foundations. These questions struck nerves, opened wounds that pride and ideology had kept carefully sealed. If America, which they had been taught to view as weak and decadent, could produce such abundance that it fed prisoners better than Germany fed its own soldiers, what did that say about the relative strengths of the two nations? If men they had been taught to despise as racial inferiors could command authority and respect, What did that suggest about the theories of superiority they had absorbed? If the enemy could show generosity and even a kind of casual kindness, what did that mean about the characterizations of Americans as barbaric and cruel? The mess hall had become more than a dining facility. It had transformed into a crucible where certainties melted and reformed into questions, where pride confronted reality and discovered that reality was more complex than any ideology could capture. Men who had entered that room secure in their beliefs, certain of their superiority despite their military defeat, now sat uncertain and unsettled, their empty plates before them serving as silent testimony to the gap between what they had expected and what they had experienced. As the morning progressed and the initial chaos settled into a kind of stunned quiet, as men finished eating and sat digesting not just food, but the implications of what had happened, the guards gradually herded them toward the door for the next phase of their daily routine. The prisoners filed out slowly, many casting backward glances at the kitchen, at the empty trays, at the guards who watched them leave with expressions that might have been sympathetic or might have been merely neutral. The mess hall emptied, returning to its normal state of bare tables and concrete floors, but the memory of what had transpired there would remain, would linger in minds and hearts long after the taste of maple syrup faded from mouths. Years would pass, the war would end, Germany would lie in ruins and begin the long process of rebuilding, and many of these prisoners would return to a homeland that barely resembled the one they had left. They would find cities reduced to rubble, economies shattered, political structures entirely transformed, families broken or lost, everything they had known fundamentally altered by the forces they had helped unleash. In the midst of all this destruction and change, in the process of trying to make sense of what had happened and why, some would find their thoughts returning to a morning in Texas, to a moment when their certainties had crumbled under the weight of something as simple and ordinary as breakfast. One former prisoner, writing in 1952, long after his return to civilian life, tried to capture what that morning had meant. He described remembering the pancakes more vividly than he remembered any bread from home, recalling their warmth and sweetness and the absurd abundance they represented. He admitted to dreaming about them sometimes, to thinking about them at odd moments, and he confessed that they had become for him a symbol of something larger, though he struggled to articulate exactly what that something was. His words, preserved in a memoir that few would read, nevertheless captured an essential truth about how small moments can carry meanings far beyond their apparent scale. Other veterans, gathering in taverns decades after the war, after Germany had rebuilt and prospered and transformed itself yet again, would sometimes speak in quiet voices about their time as prisoners in America, and invariably someone would mention the food, would talk about being fed better as a captive than they had been as soldiers fighting for their own country. These conversations, often lubricated by beer and the loosening of inhibitions that comes with age and distance from events, revealed layers of resentment and confusion and recognition that had been buried for years under the demands of survival and reconstruction and moving forward with life. Some men, unable to reconcile what they had experienced with what they had been taught, chose simply not to speak of it at all, carrying the memory in silence, a private contradiction they never resolved. Others incorporated it into narratives of having been deceived, of having served leaders who had lied to them about the nature of the war and the character of the enemy. A few, a small but significant few, allowed the memory to serve as a kind of pivot point, a moment when they began to question everything they had believed, when they started the difficult process of examining their own assumptions and prejudices and certainties. One such man, sitting in his garden decades later with a granddaughter on his lap, found himself thinking about how to answer when she asked him about America, about the war, about his experiences. He could have told her about battles or hardships or the mechanics of capture and imprisonment, but instead he found himself chuckling softly and saying that the Americans had given them pancakes, that he had never forgotten the taste, that it had been a moment of understanding something he hadn't known he needed to understand. The child looked at him with wide, uncomprehending eyes, too young to grasp how something as mundane as breakfast could carry such weight, but he patted her head gently and smiled, content to let the mystery remain mysterious for now, knowing that some lessons can only be learned through direct experience. The slow pour of syrup over golden pancakes, catching the morning light and glistening like liquid amber, became in memory almost symbolic, a moment frozen in time when hunger and abundance met, when pride and humility collided, when enemies discovered unexpected common ground in the simple shared human experience of eating together. For those who carried this memory, it remained vivid long after other details of the war faded, more powerful in its mundane simplicity than grand battles or dramatic events, proof that history lives not only in its epic moments, but in its smallest details, in the taste of butter on the tongue and the sweetness of syrup sliding down the throat. The war, of course, continued long after that morning, continued through more battles and more deaths and more suffering than anyone could fully comprehend. But for the men in that mess hall, something had shifted. Some barrier had been crossed that could never quite be rebuilt. They would go on being prisoners, would continue their routines of work details and roll calls and endless waiting behind barbed wire, but they would do so with altered perspectives, with questions they couldn't quite silence, with memories of a morning when the world had proven stranger and more complex than they had imagined. History remembers wars through their generals and battles, through strategic decisions and political consequences, through victories and defeats measured in territory and casualties. The official histories of World War II overflow with accounts of campaigns and movements, of decisions made in war rooms and carried out on battlefields, of nations rising and falling, of ideologies clashing and technologies advancing. Within all these grand narratives, there is little room for a breakfast in a Texas POW camp, little space for the story of men discovering that pancakes could undermine certainty more effectively than any military defeat. Yet perhaps this smaller story carries truths that the grander narratives miss, truths about the human capacity for surprise and change, about how beliefs can be challenged by experiences that fall outside the expected patterns, about the ways that simple generosity can communicate more powerfully than complex arguments. The prisoners who sat in that mess hall had marched under flags proclaiming hatred and superiority, had fought for a cause that elevated some at the expense of others, had absorbed ideologies that required seeing fellow humans as less than fully human. What disarmed many of them, at least partially and at least temporarily, was not force or argument, but the unexpected gentleness of being fed well by those they had been taught to despise. Decades after the last veteran of that morning passed away, after all the first-hand memories had faded into documents and artifacts and second-hand accounts, the story survived because it captured something essential about the complicated nature of conflict and reconciliation, about how transformation can begin with the smallest gestures, about how the most ordinary aspects of life, eating and sharing food, can become vehicles for profound realizations. The pancakes, golden and soft and almost absurdly sweet, had been nothing more than standard American breakfast food, prepared according to military recipes by cooks who were just doing their jobs. Yet in that time and place, for those particular men, they became something more, became a moment of recognition that the world was wider and stranger than propaganda had suggested. The mess hall emptied each morning and filled again each meal, the routine continuing day after day as the seasons changed and the war progressed and eventually ended. New prisoners arrived, old prisoners were transferred, guards rotated through their assignments, and life in the camp settled into its predictable rhythms. But among those who had been present that particular morning, among the men who had laughed and then fallen silent and then scrambled for seconds, the memory persisted, carried forward into peacetime and old age, a small bright moment of surprise in a war full of darkness and suffering. When trying to understand how people change, how beliefs shift and certainties crack and new understandings emerge, it can be tempting to look for dramatic turning points, for confrontations and crises that force immediate transformation. Sometimes, though, change works more subtly, seeping in through small openings, accumulating in quiet moments, building slowly until the foundation of old certainties no longer seems quite as solid as it once did. For some of the men in that mess hall, the pancakes were such a moment, not a complete transformation, but a crack in the edifice, a moment when doubt entered, when questions began to form that would take years to fully explore. The taste lingered, sweet and warm and undeniable, a sensory memory that could not be explained away or rationalized into submission. In the months and years that followed, when former prisoners tried to make sense of their experiences, tried to understand how they had come to fight for a cause that brought such destruction, tried to reconcile their past selves with their present realities, some would find themselves thinking about pancakes, about the moment when American abundance confronted German pride and won without even trying, simply by being what it was. This was not a story about food conquering evil or meals bringing peace. The world remained far too complex for such simple narratives. But it was a story about human beings encountering the unexpected and being changed by it, about how certainty can be undermined by experience, about how the smallest acts of ordinary generosity can plant seeds that grow in unexpected directions. The prisoners who laughed that morning were not instantly converted or transformed. Many carried their old beliefs for years afterward, some perhaps for life. But they had all experienced a moment when reality contradicted expectation in ways they couldn't ignore, when the enemy showed a human face they had been taught not to see, when hunger revealed that ideology could not satisfy all needs. In the end, perhaps that is what made the story worth preserving and retelling, not because it offered easy answers or comfortable lessons, but because it captured something true about the complicated, contradictory, often surprising nature of human experience. Wars are fought by human beings who eat and sleep and hunger and remember, who carry beliefs but also experience doubts, who can laugh and then fall silent and then wonder what their laughter meant. The pancakes, ridiculous and mundane and utterly ordinary, became extraordinary simply by existing in that particular time and place, by offering German prisoners a taste of something they had not expected and could not easily forget, by serving as an unlikely instrument of recognition that enemies are also human beings who can be moved by sweetness and warmth and the simple act of being fed.